Before I begin, apparently today is Tuesday, but yesterday, which by the way was Tu B'Shvat, right? There was an incredible catastrophe actually that happened in Turkey, and from what I understand, it's absolutely devastating, But before I begin, let me just mention this year should be a blessing and a merit for the health and success of the families of Regina Bas Yosef Reuven and Yeshaya ben Yisrael, Benjamin Wolf ben Tzvihersh, and Baruch ben Benjamin Wolf. Yeah. In any case, so I wanted to speak a little about that, very briefly, because this kind of thing is obviously, something which should be mentioned, should be brought down, and so on, Anyway, what's interesting is what happened, first of all, as far as I know, I have limited resources here. I'm giving this here from Eretz Yisrael. But it happened, Monday at something like 5 a.m. in the morning, which is Tu B'Shvat. Now, Tu B'Shvat, we know, right? And I'm going to speak about that today, because it just happened, yesterday and so on. But this devastation, this earthquake happened on Tu B'Shvat. And in fact, what happened is that it was a 7.8 earthquake on the Richter scale, which is very powerful, very powerful. It's unusual. And I understand that thousands and thousands of people have died. Somebody told me that 5,000 buildings have collapsed. Could you imagine? And we're not talking about two-family houses. We're talking about, maybe 10-story buildings and so on. Could you imagine the devastation in Turkey? And it happened in southeast Turkey, including Syria, maybe some other countries and so on. And obviously it was a devastating earthquake, So they're expecting tens of thousands of people to have been killed by this earthquake. And not only that, but apparently what there was is not just one earthquake. Shortly thereafter, there was a second earthquake. It wasn't even an aftershock, because many times after an earthquake, you have what's called aftershocks. So the earthquake itself is devastating. In this case, was a 7.8, whereas the aftershock, maybe it's 2 or 3 or whatever. But apparently there was a second earthquake that was 7.2, which is almost as bad as the other one. So we're talking about at least 2 major earthquakes, and I understand that there have been 4. So they must be going out of their mind. I mean, the fear, because it's one after the other. That's what seems to be happening. And not only that, to add to the devastation, it is now going to be 14 degrees below zero for the next 10 days in southeast Turkey. 14 degrees, could you imagine that? I mean, not only do they not have a home, who knows how many people have been injured and so on, but how can they survive in 14 degrees below zero? Obviously not. So what we're looking at is a major catastrophe, but what we're really looking at is a major display of midas hadin, of justice, punishment. That's obviously what it is. That the Rosh Hashanah has visited upon Turkey, Syria, maybe 1 or 2 other countries and so on. Now what's important to consider is when it happened. It happened on Tu B'Shvat. Now Tu B'Shvat, we know, which is the 15th day of Shvat, that's when this series of earthquakes happened, is really a Rosh Hashanah. It is a Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara, the Talmud says this, the Mishnah, so on, that it's the Rosh Hashanah of Ilonis, of Paris, of fruit, you see, of the trees, yeah. Because that's when the fruit of the tree begins to blossom. And that's called the Rosh Hashanah of trees, Ilonis, and so on, And this is a Mishnah. And it says in the Mishnah that this is the world is judged on the Rosh Hashanah. And the Mishnah, the Talmud reckons that there are 4 of them. there are 4 Rosh Hashanahs, one of which, like I said, is Tu B'Shvat. And the world is judged. Now, when the world is judged, it doesn't mean only for that particular item, because there are peripheral judgments. There are peripheral judgments that occur.
It's Laura.
Hi,
Rabbi.
I'm giving this year now. In any case, so this is what's happening. Okay? So this, therefore, tremendous devastation of Turkey happened on Tu B'Shvat, which is a Rosh Hashanah, which is a Yom Hadin, and it includes many other peripherals of a judgment day, you see. And obviously, therefore, it seems so incredible that this devastation happened on a Yom Hadin, on a day of justice. Now, we don't really know why things happen, certainly local. It's very hard to know why the Rebbeinu Shalom does anything. But we do know, obviously, just from the extent of destruction, right, that it's a major punishment, obviously, especially when tens of thousands of lives, hundreds of millions of dollars are going to be spent fixing up everything, repairing everything and so on. So the question really, if we can think about it, is that what's going on? So there are several thoughts which I'd like to share. The first thing, Turkey is famous for a tremendous genocide that they performed. During World War I think it's 1916, the Turks threw out the Armenians and they forced them to go over the Syrian desert. Over 1 million of them. Some people say it's 1.2 million Armenians. And that was, a tremendous devastation for the people of Armenia. It was, an expulsion and therefore a tremendous genocide. Over 1 million Armenians died because of what Turkey did to Armenia. And they're next door, Azerbaijan and so on. See. In any case, this is what the Turks did, you see. And they've always tried to minimize, maybe even deny what they did. Well, what we see interesting, and we see it from Ukraine, what the Russian is doing seems to be paying back many nations that he has a score to settle with them, you see. In other words, it's called payback time. We've already seen that it's happening, a tremendous amount of magnitude with Ukraine. And now this devastation happened with Turkey, you see. And which would make sense. Why? Because you have to remember that before the Mashiach comes, especially toward the end, there's always some type of retribution. The Russian wants to settle scores, as they say, and apparently this is what's happening. All over the world we have all kinds of weather extremes, right? Like for instance in Buffalo, there was a snowstorm that was over 7 feet tall. I mean, that's a sakana. I mean, you can't even survive in that kind of a snowstorm. Imagine being locked in like that. But it's all over the United States. The drought in Los Angeles and so on. So there's no question that there's a tremendous amount of weather extremes, a lot of natural disasters that are happening really all over the world. So now we've experienced something that has happened to Turkey. I mean, this is going to set them back, tremendously and so on. But again, I mean, it's hard to know exactly what happened with Turkey, or why. But we do know that they killed or are responsible for the death of over 1 million Armenians without any mercy, which is interesting. So this is what I'm saying. I believe it. It's really a payback time. It's a Yom Hadin for many, many things going on in the entire world, you see. So I wanted to mention that these things are not an accident. We're not talking here about something that just happened to happen. There's a whole what's called cheshbon for what's going on. In any case, so I just wanted to make those statements, those ideas about Turkey and the general state of the world, you see. Now, I wanted to talk about, a certain concept, certain idea. Like I say, yesterday was Tu B'Shvat, right, which I had mentioned briefly now, that Tu B'Shvat is a very, very important day. It's one of the 4 Rosh Hashanahs that the Talmud, that the Mishnah talks about, you see, and it's also obviously, like I said, Rosh Hashanah, and the world in many ways is judged, and so on, So the concept of Tu B'Shvat is really is a very important concept, you see. And in many ways, this idea of Tu B'Shvat is tied in to the redemption process. And that's what I wanted to do, speak about that, the redemption process, and the significance in many ways of Tu B'Shvat. In any case, when you look at Hashkafa in general, you see, you notice that there's certain patterns that keep repeating themselves, you see. And I'm going to go through some of them, and from within that context, we can understand that either Tu B'Shvat or whatever is all part of that pattern. What is the pattern of what's called the Tikkun process, which is the entire attempt at the Jewish people to bring God back, into the creation, into the world itself, and to usher in the Messianic era? There are 2 major patterns. One is called Histalkus. Histalkus means removal, okay? And the second pattern is called Hispashtus, to expand, to extend, to grow, and so on, you see? So these are 2 patterns which in many ways always happen. The restriction of the world, and also the expansion of the world. Now, of the world, I specifically mean the presence of God. There is always a time when God is removed from the world, you see. And then there's a time that God is present in the world. So when he's removed or concealed, that's called Histalkus, removal, the divine presence. And when he is exposed, in that sense, revealed, that's called Hispashtus, which means the expansion of God. And these things go back and forth, depending on the acts of the Jews, you see. So let's take a look at this, how it works. And once you see this, you'll also understand the basic messianic process, or the process of redemption itself. Especially today illustrates it very strongly, very powerfully, this whole concept. There are certain realities that the Rebbeinu Shalom does, and I'm going to give them to you. There are basically a lot of them, or I'm going to list 6 of them, different realities that God created until he finally came to the reality of our world. And we will see that this is what's called Histalkus. It's a descent. It is removing reality further and further away from God, so as to provide a certain climate or environment that man can exist and therefore be tempted and be tried, tested, and so on. So we're going to look at a reality of this, of what's called, I call it the descent, where things go down, the Histalkus. So the first reality, obviously, is the reality of God. And that's unknowable. We have no idea who God is, what his real nature is, and so on, which I've spoken in the past extensively. Then what God does is he creates something which is called a representation of himself, although obviously it's not himself, but it is some type of divine force that represents him in terms of the creation. And what those forces are, those are the 10 spheres. Those are 10, what appears to be emanations from his being, although it's not really his being. He creates them. The spheres are really created entities. But they have a nature which is incredibly powerful. They actually are sort of like his handiwork, where he uses them, tools, instruments, to create other realities. So that's the first reality, or I should say the second. God is the first. These 10 emanations, which are they're referred to as divine, because they represent God. These are the spheres. Then God creates. What he does is he uses these spheres to create the greatest entity ever known, and will ever be known, and that is called a neshama, a soul. See, what God does is he creates what's called an other, because one of the fundamental characteristics that we see in the Torah of God is called Einei Milvadoi. Besides God, there is nothing else. So what God has to make or do is to create the possibility of an other, because right now, Einei Milvadoi, besides God, there is nothing else. And that's not figurative. It is literal. So what God does, and that's one of the first acts of creation, is he creates a reality called other. Besides God, something else can also exist. You see, that's the creation of a phenomenon called an other, or in Hebrew it's called a zulosoi. And that zulosoi, or that other being, so to speak, that God creates, besides himself existing, but he creates this, is the neshama, is the soul of a Jewish person. You see, or whoever has the neshama. In any case, so the neshama, or the soul, we have no idea what it is, what its nature is, but it's basically us in that sense, okay? And that is the greatest entity ever made, you see. So that's a third reality, the reality of the neshama, which is a direct result of God's creating the concept or the phenomenon of other, you see. Now, then you have a fourth reality, right? And that's called spiritual, right? The neshama is greater than just being spiritual, you see. It's called a zulosoi. It's something other than God. That's how close it is, in that sense, to God. So he then creates a spiritual reality. And that's the reality of spiritual beings. Angels, for instance, other kind of forces that he creates, and they are in the realm of a spiritual world. So that's called the Olam HaRuchni, you see. And that encompasses several worlds, different classes of angels. And there are 10 classes of angels. And they all inhabit these worlds and so on, But their reality is much inferior to the reality of the neshama. Then after God creates a spiritual world, right, of angelic beings and so on, he then creates a new kind of reality, and that is Geshem, material or physical, right? God creates a reality which is physical, and that's the reality that we know about, the physical universe. And that's the entire, 13.7 billion light years across. That is the reality of the world of Geshem, physical materiality and so on. And he creates that, and what he does, he combines, and this is really remarkable, he combines the reality of neshama, which is the greatest entity ever made, right, after the spheres. And he combines that with Geshem. He inserts, so to speak, a neshama, that entity, into the physical world. So the neshama now has what's called a physical body, you see. Even though the neshama, the soul, is of a completely different nature than the physical world. But God wants the soul to be inserted into the physical universe. So the basic idea is that the physical universe will now serve as a barrier, as a blockage to the ability of the neshama to see that there is a spiritual world. Certainly not to see its own nature, because that is the supreme test. Will that individual or the soul, will that come to its efforts, a realization, right, that there is an entire reality, right, which is spiritual, it's even greater than spirituality? Will it recognize that and therefore begin to serve God, who is above that all, or will it be fooled, you see, and think that all there is a physical reality? There is no spirituality. Or even, God forbid, there is no God, or whatever. So that's the supreme test. What does the neshama recognize about reality? You see? And therefore, this world, the neshama is in this world physically as a barrier. And this world, this universe, is called the Olam HaShofel, the low world. It's purely physical. What do we see? We see that this is called the descent, where man has been removed from God in order to allow him a situation where he can be tested. You see? So that's it. You have those 6 realities. The reality of God, the reality of the neshama, which is called an other. Then I should say before that, the spheres, the divine emanations. Then the reality of the neshama, as I said. Then the reality of the spiritual universes. Okay? And then there's the reality of the Geshem, which is immaterial. Now, there's one more reality. And the original intent of God was that this reality, I mean, we know that the neshama is inserted into a physical body, that we know. But there's one more reality which is even lower than the physical, and that is the satanic reality. It is a reality that's inhabited by the Satan and whatever his minions are that assist him, you see. And he basically has 3 jobs. The first job is to tempt man, right? To tempt him. That's the first job of the Satan. In that role, he's called the Yetzer Hara. And his job is to try to convince man that he is equal to God, or perhaps he's the only thing that exists, and not God at all. Second idea of the Satan is that he's also a prosecuting attorney, angel. His job is to prosecute a person in the heavenly tribunal if that person sins. In that role, he's called the Satan, right? The Satan means an adversary, so he's a prosecutor. And the third role is called the Malach HaMoves, which is the angel of death. Doesn't mean he kills necessarily, although he does that too, right? But his job is to execute the judgment that is decided by the heavenly tribunal. There you are. 3 jobs for the Satan: tempter, prosecutor, and executioner. In other words, what he is really in charge of is the concept of din, or justice. You see, he makes sure that a man will live his life and be forced to conform to justice. And based on the amount of justice that he does, that is the amount of the future world that he will get, you see. So that satanic world is the lowest one, you see. Now that's also called the Sitra Achra, the other side, because he is the other side of what? Of the Sitra de Kedusha, the side of holiness, you see. So they're basically 2 different sides. There's a side of holiness, which is connected in a certain sense to the realm of God. And then there's a side, Sitra Achra, which means the other side, the side of the Satan, that is connected to the netherworld, however you want to call it, and so on. And the main climate or environment of that world is the Satan, his minions, but especially the Zoyamor. Now the Zoyamor, I once mentioned, is a projection of the Satan. It's sort of like a field, a force field, that projects from his being, and it connects on to different things. And one of the things that the Satan is connected to is the physical world, you see. So the Satan is connected to the physical world through what is called the Zoyama. That's what it's called. Zoya means pollution, contaminant. That's what it means. Because he is able to pollute or contaminate you see, through his projection called the Zoyama. It's like an octopus with his tentacles, He's able to control things around him because he has an extension called tentacles. Same idea with the Satan, you see. Now, man being created, as we will see, you see, man being created does not have Zoyama in it when he was created. He is pure neshama that is inserted into pure geshem. That's all there was at the beginning or before Adam's sin. It was just Adam, right? And he was, like I said, inserted into a physical body. He's not at all connected to the Satan because Adam, in a certain sense, although we don't know the exact nature of Adam, or Rishon, first man, the first man was not connected to the physical world, even though he is physical. But he was not connected to the aspect of the physical world that the Satan and his Zoyama, right, is connected to, which is interesting. So therefore the Satan, in order to tempt Adam, had to tempt him external to the body of man. This was the condition that man was in, right, at the end, or right before the sin, which is what he later did, and so on. That's a very important idea, you see. So we have these type of realities, but the reality of Satan was never really part in a connected way to the reality of Adam Harishon. However, when he sinned, he became connected to the physical world tremendously. And since he's connected now, he became a true physical being. What a drastic change. So because of that, he is now connected to the Satan because the Satan has dominion, control over the physical world through his what? Through his Zoyama, you see. So therefore we are now connected to the Zoyama because of the sin of Adam Rishon. And therefore we are subject to the satanic force called the Zoyama. Now I once mentioned, but it's really interesting to say, that means that the physical universe is subject to two forces or phenomenon. And this is classically satanic. The first force, right, of the Satan, and we are connected to that, that the Zoyama is connected to the physical world, is that in the world of biological creatures, means creatures that truly live, including man, the Satan's Zoyama will deteriorate or decompose biological matter, living matter. So what happens is, obviously, if a person or any creature who lives will decompose, right, then that creature will die. So that's the first thing. If you get connected to his world, physical, with his Zoyama, then eventually you die, because that's what the Satan does. He's what's called a demolition expert. He destroys. What's interesting also is not just the animate world, but the inanimate world is also connected to the Satan, and that's the second law of thermodynamics, which is called the law of entropy, that all energy forces dissipate. Everything is canceled in that sense. You see, like if you walk into a hot room, eventually it will cool off unless you pump in new energy, new heat. You see, that's also satanic in nature. So this is what happens, very briefly and so on. Now God never intended, we to be connected to the Satan directly. I mean, he wanted the Satan to influence us, tempt us, which he did, because the manifestation of the Satan is who? Really is, there's Adam Harishon, but the manifestation of the Satan is the Nachash, the snake. You see? But the snake was external to the human body. There was a creature outside of it trying to convince it to eat from the tree. You see, once Adam ate from the tree, then immediately he became truly physical. And because he became physical, right, he would be subject to death. So therefore, God never intended this to be. It was up to the choice of Adam. But since Adam did do that, he becomes, as I said, subject to death. So Adam now, what is the job of Adam? Well, the original job of Adam is called to reverse the realities, or to retransform the realities. In other words, to get rid of the Geshem, where the Geshem actually, what God does, which is interesting, is that he empowers the neshama to be what it always is, an unbelievable force that can turn any physical matter into a spiritual form. Totally. That's what the neshama could do. If it was ever released or allowed to be what it could be. But the Russian keeps it in check. But at a certain time, he wants the neshama to take the physical body of which it has, you see, and reverse it. That's called zikoch. That is called purifying, to remove the material matter of the body and to change it into an incredibly spiritual form. It's almost like it's translucent, you see. And then, after that, to go even further, higher and higher. So what the Rebbeinu Shem really wants is called zikoch. He wants a retransformation of these realities. He wants to take your Geshem, retransform it into a spiritual form, you see. However, the problem with that, and actually what he would do then is he would go higher. So the man, once his neshama has the power to reverse the physical body, it would now ascend. That's the spastas. It would change realities. It would change all the worlds, you see, higher and higher, until finally it would get to the world called Olam Haba. And that's the world that the neshama is in. That is the reward, the world of incredible reward, where it, the neshama itself, can experience God in a way which we cannot even begin to comprehend. Where we now actually experience who we are, who God is in that sense, and there's an unbelievable attachment, you see. But that takes a long time. You have to go from what's called the physical world, we transform the physical body into a, let's call it an angelic body, and then to go from an angelic body all the way to a Zerosai body, which is the neshama's real body, so to speak, and then it remains in the future world to be together, connected together for all eternity. That's what God wanted. The problem was, as I mentioned, right, is that Adam HaRishon became connected to the Sultan because he now became physical because of the sin, right, of eating from the tree. Therefore, his first job now is not just to purify Geshem, which is physical matter. His first job is to evict the Zayamah. You need to get rid of the pollution in the physical body itself before you can begin the journey, right, or the operation of changing the physical body into a higher form, you see? So this became necessitated. Why? It became necessitated because of the sin of Adam HaRishon. And this obviously has now become the mission. So he has to get rid of the Zoyama, right? And then he could begin to change. And once the Zoyama leaves, right, then the man is now without Zoyama, and therefore, obviously, he's no longer subject to death. This is really what occurs, getting rid of the Zoyama, and therefore returning to your previous state of being just a physical body, Geshem, without Zoyama. This is what really occurs in the Messianic era, right? You see, in the Messianic era, we now are equal to Adam HaRishon before the sin, you see, because the Mashiach ben David destroys the Satan, whatever, whether he kills him or whatever. So there is no longer any Satan. There's no Sitra Achra, other side, right? There's no death. There's no disease, no decomposition. nothing. A man lives forever, never gets sick, and so on. And all of this is in the Messianic era, because there is no Zoyama, you see. So that's what happens in the Messianic era, you see, where all humans, especially the Jews, will be equal to Adam Harishon before the sin. Then, when the world ends in the English year 2240, which is the year 6000, then the entire world will be purified. So the physical universe actually changes, which in many ways is fascinating. You see, the physical universe changes into a spiritual universe. That's what happens, you see. And man also begins to change, where his physical body begins to change after the world is over. And he goes higher and higher. That's the ascent. After the descent, the different realities. Now he's ascending, you see. And finally, he enters, Kabbalistically, what's called Adam Kadmon, primordial man. And what that is, Olam Haba. That is the future world. And that is a world that he does not remain static. He grows infinitely. The world of Olam Haba, which is again called Adam Kadmon, primordial man in Kabbalah, that world goes on forever. And a person grows in that world from every nanosecond to nanosecond. I mean, we have no idea what that even means. But that is the world truly, with the neshama, who is the zulosoi, who is the concept of other. The purest form of any entity will now exist in that place, specifically tailored to connect to God and to attach greater and greater. Okay? So there we see the descent, if you recall, where the realities change finally to a physical and also to a world of Zoyama. And then we see the ascent, which is the hypostasis, right? We see the reversal, and then his growth, and we see what the stages are. Okay? It's a very important concept. Now, just like we see the concept of a descent and an ascent, right, which is part of the tikkun process, we also see it in terms of the environments that the Jewish people find themselves. Now, if you recall, after they left, Egypt, and after they left, not only left Egypt, but they went into the desert and so on, they went into Israel. So the first real environment that the Jews found themselves was in their own kingdom. So what God wanted, that in their own kingdom they should serve and worship God. It's almost like it's called an Abdus kingdom, a kingdom of servants and slaves to God, where God wanted everybody to do the mitzvahs. So therefore that era was for many hundreds of years, right? It started off, of course, with Shaul HaMelech. He became king, and continuously, David HaMelech, Shlomo HaMelech, and so on, you see. So what God wanted to the Jewish people to be in the environment, that environment, right? And to worship and serve God. But obviously it didn't work out that way, because they worshipped idols, bad stuff, right? So as a result of that, they now entered different environments that they would now be subjected to, and this is a descent. It is a descent, right, where God further removes himself from the Jewish people so they can be tested with more and more concealment of the presence of God, you see. So the first one we encounter is Babylon, right? And Babylon was an interesting place, you see. Babylon was a place that was spiritual, but it was Avodah Zarah also. They believed in God, or gods, I should say, right? So they had a spiritual sensitivity. The problem was, it was filled with Avodah Zarah. It was filled with idol worship and so on. But at least in a certain sense, it was spiritual, because they did believe in a supreme higher being, you see. So that was the first reality, as it descended worse and worse, right, to try to pass the test. Then after that, you had what's called Paras, Persia, right? And Persia, of course, was a very physical nation, you see. They were really into pleasure, physicality, and so on. That's Persia, right? So that's a descent. It's no longer really spiritual in that sense, right? But it's basically tremendous obsession or involvement with Geshem, physicality. Then after that, it got worse, right? And as a result of that, we come to the next environment called Yavan, or Greece. Now Greece, it's not that they were physical, although they were very physical. I mean, they loved the arts and whatever, the plays and literature and all that kind of stuff, right? But they were tremendously into philosophy and science. What they thought about, is there an alternative view of reality besides God? So what they did is they came up with an entire different alternative view of reality. It's not only, in that sense, physical, but it's an entire chokhmah, wisdom, that the Greeks had. In fact, they are responsible, really, for modernity. Historians view them as the origin of modernity, with Aristotle and, of course, Alexander the Great and so on. See, so that reality is a descent. Why? Because it's bad enough to be, avodah zarah, but at least a spirituality. It's also bad enough to be really into the physical. But these guys were into chokhmah. But that chokhmah, that wisdom, right, was an alternate view of reality, which makes it much more difficult to see the truth that God is in control and dominates all creation. So in that sense, this is an environment of descent. Then we have the descent again, but this time it's not Greece, it's Rome. Now Rome did originate certain things, but mostly Rome was the bearer, you see. Rome was the bearer of Greek wisdom. They brought it throughout the entire world. That's who they really were. See, and this is the descent. And Rome then, of course, which I've mentioned many times, Rome as a country or a nation became a religion, and that was Christianity. And then, of course, Christianity is basically the whole concept of Western civilization, and ultimately, this is the bottom descent. The interesting thing we find today is that this type of civilization called Rome, or Christianity, or Western civilization, which is what it really is, right? They have deteriorated. Not only have they adapted all the previous attributes of the previous environments, but they have now incredibly corrupted all the environments. And when you look around today, you realize the incredible depravity and corruption of the world. I don't want to go into all the craziness that the world is into, but it is severely depraved, promiscuous, corrupt, and so on, you see. And that is the greatest descent of all. To find yourself in that type of environment is very bad. It's very hard to pull yourself out of that. And that's what the world is into. The world is into themselves. That's what it is. The world is into defiance of God. They are into defiance of morality and ethics, you see. And they are into stuff which is not even, it's anti-civilization. The whole concept of LGBTQ, the whole concept of not only that, but the whole concept of, you have to be careful of your pronouns, right? Abortions, murder, and so on. Incredible corruption of society. This is what we're into. So that is the environment that has the lowest descent. However, there will be an ascent. What is that? The Messianic era. As I mentioned, that the Messianic era is something, right, which the world has never seen before. It is the changing completely of the entire world order, you see. And it's a reality that we have never really even seen. In any case, so there you are. The descent of environments as the Jews get tested more and more difficultly, right? And so on. And then finally, when the world will have reached its most depraved state, right? Then the Messianic era, which will be the complete ascent. Now, we also find, interestingly enough, these concepts of where it gets worse and it gets better by time, the cycle of time. Let's take a look at that. And that's where we begin to see Tu B'Shvat. The world starts off with the creation, which happened in Tishrei, right? So in Tishrei, we know it's Rosh Hashanah, and the world is created. But in the same time, almost immediately, man began to fall. That was the fall of man because he ate from the tree, you see. Not only that, but you also have the whole concept of Cain and Hevel. Cain killed Hevel. That's the first murder. So you begin to find in Tishrei the real descent of man. Tishrei is the beginning of that cycle of the fall of man. Then the next month is Cheshvan. Now Cheshvan, man falls to such an extent where God brings a mabul. And this is the generation of Noach, you see. And the mabul was worse than Tishrei, the generation of Adam, because the world had reached the Memte Shari Tumah, the 49 levels of defilement or contamination or pollution, to such an extent where God said, I want to destroy the world. So this is what happened, right, in terms of Cheshvan. Then finally there is a slight, not ascent, but there's a stabilization. And that stabilization is really, that's the occurrence of Hanukkah, you see. Because Hanukkah, what all Hanukkah basically did is it reestablished the status quo of the Jewish people by rededicating the temple, you see. So it formally reestablished what was. So at least that is some type of, as I said, stabilization of the descent. That started from the month of Tishrei, then we have the concepts in Cheshvan, right? And Tishrei, like I said, is a reestablishment of that time. Then we come to the month of Teves. Now Teves, again, is a further descent. You see, what does that mean? Because Teves is a certain type of month that's the mazel of Esav. Esav, the brother of Yaakov, his mazel means his month that apparently he becomes supremely victorious is the month of Teves. And that's one of the reasons why Asar B'Teves was the beginning of the destruction of the temple, right? At the hands of Babylon, right? Then you have many holidays which are in Teves, you know, let's say Christianity or Christmas or whatever, and that's the holiday of Rome and so on. And what Rome is basically is Esav. So Teves is a month that has the mazel of Esav. It's a winter month, which makes sense. It's a month, right, that has the longest night, right, the darkest time, and the freezing cold, the worst part of the winter, is in Teves, and so on. So that's the descent, you see. But then it starts to go up, that the mazel of Esav changes and disappears. And that's the month of Shvat. And Shvat is where we find the New Year's, right, the New Year of the trees and so on, where the fruit begin to bloom. So Shvat is really the beginning of the mazel of what's called Yosef. And that is the ascent, where we're now coming up, away from Esav. So the mazel of Yosef starts at Tu B'Shvat, on the 15th day of Shvat, which is the Rosh Hashanah, like I said, right, of trees and so on, right? And that's a very good sign. And it's also a time when there's a lot of retribution in Shvat, because that's when we have an ascent. We not only have the ascent of Kedusha, holiness, we also have the ascent, right, in terms of the retribution of sinners, which are apparently, you know, people who are somewhat deserving of what God does, and so on, you know, which is unfortunately happening now, and so on. But in any case, so Shvat, which starts Tu B'Shvat, half of the month of Shvat begins the mazel of Yosef, you see. And that continues all the way into Adar. Now Adar is the month of Yosef, basically, you see. I think the astronomical sign or the astrological sign is Pisces, the fish, and the fish we know, of course, is the sign of Yosef. By the way, the astrological sign of Teves is Capricorn, the goat. We know Esav is a seir, is a goat, Har Seir, you see. In any case, so Adar is the beginning or the real month of Yosef, and we know, of course, that Adar has Purim, which is the end of Haman. It's the end of the ability of evil, in a certain sense, to flourish. And that's what Adar is. And you have to remember, that's the Mashiach ben Yosef. That month, in many ways, is a messianic month of Mashiach ben Yosef. You see. Then, of course, we have what's called Nisan, which is the actual redemption itself. You see. And that's in the month of David, and that's when the redemption of Egypt, of course, took place. And Nisan, therefore, it says that just like they were redeemed in Egypt, in Nisan, they will be redeemed in Nisan in the future also. So that remains the mazel of Nisan, the mazel of the Geula, the redemption itself. Then we continue with the 49 days of Iyar, right, when they left Egypt, and then of course Sivan, right, so Iyar is an intermediary month, you see. And Sivan, of course, is the month of Matan Torah. You see how the months of the year, they go down, up, down, and then now we go back up again. You see, it's descent and it's ascent. And then, of course, you have the month of Tammuz, and Tammuz has Shiva Osibet Tammuz, which is the Chet Egel, the sin of the golden calf, of course, you know, and that's Moshe Rabbeinu broke the Luchos. So that's Tammuz. There we go down again, right? And then, of course, you have Ov, right, Tisha B'Av, which is the destruction of the two temples. And then we begin to go up again, Elul, which is the month of Tshuva, you see. And again, we start back again in Tishrei. So you notice that the Jews are always being subjected to going closer to God or getting further away, what's called histalkus, right, to remove yourself, to descend away from God, or hispashtus, to spread, to extend, to grow toward God. And you have many cycles that mirror this. Descend and then ascend, and so on. And I've illustrated, you know, the whole purpose of creation and stuff, the realities, the kingdoms, the empires, and so on. And then the months of the year. There's a continuous flow, up and down, in terms of the idea, the tikkun process. So we see, therefore, what, as I said, Tu B'Shvat. Tu B'Shvat really is the beginning of the mazel of Yosef. It's the beginning. So as such, it's a very good time, because like I said, that leads into Adar, which leads into Nisan, and so on, you see. So far, this is basically what we see happening. Now, what we see also, which I just want to mention, is Egypt itself in Nisan. There was a descent. The Jews were at the 49th level of tumah, right? They were at the 49th level of sinning, which we know from the Chazal that tell us that. So that's a tremendous amount of descent. But then, with the advent of the redemption, it began to ascend. And you had the Makkos, right? You had the plagues, or the blows against Egypt. And not only that, as it was a punishment to Egypt, each Makkah was a tremendous revelation of some aspect or characteristic of the divine presence. A Makkah was not just a punishment to the Egyptians. It was also a revelation of some type of divine exposure that the Jews were able to see, you see. And that, of course, went up, right? Then you had when the Egyptians threw them out, which of course means that God gathered the Jews to leave Egypt. That's what he wanted. Then, of course, you had the Jews at the Kriyas Yamsuf, right? Where the Jews themselves at that Kriyas Yamsuf began to see revelations which were absolutely beyond belief. Like it says in the Chazal, that a maidservant, a Hebrew maidservant, saw more Kabbalistically and spiritually and divine secrets than Yechezkel, who is the author of the Divine Chariot, one of the fundamental structures of Kabbalah. She saw more than he did, you see, and because that's the beginning of the ascent toward redemption. And then, of course, finally, you come to then you had the whole 49 days where the Jews ascended. And finally, they're standing at Mount Torah, which almost became a Messianic era. Had the Jews not done the golden calf, then Moshe Rabbeinu would have been Mashiach ben Yosef.